from the College by the Lake, Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. Local, regional, national, and international guests discussing the issues and topics affecting the way you live are on Forum, the North Idaho College Public Forum, with your host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart.
On today's program, we're going to discuss the search for Amelia Earhart. For over 50 years, Americans and others around the world have been fascinated with this question and what happened, and we have a very expert guest that has just recently finished a book on this fascinating topic. I'm very pleased to welcome to the program a native of Idaho, Randall Brink. In fact, he lives here in North Idaho and also has a home in Arizona. He is well published. He mostly publishes novels, but certainly this book is not one of those, and we would recommend it to you. It's called Lost Star, The Search for Amelia Earhart. In the United States, this book is published by W.W. Norton, and in England, it's published by Bloomsbury. Our guest also says on the cover of his book, "Her mysterious disappearance solved at last." Also, I'm very proud to say that years ago, Randall Brink was a student at North Idaho College and has gone on to have great success in the world of publishing. Randall, it's a pleasure to welcome you back once again to North Idaho College, and thank you for taking time out from a busy schedule of writing. And I know you've recently completed a tour of the United States about this book. And again, welcome to North Idaho College Public Forum.
Well, thank you for having me, Tony. It's a pleasure.
And I'm very pleased, as always, to have our two regular panel members to join in the questioning of our guest. First of all is Janelle Berg, who is an attorney in the state of Idaho, and next to her is Steve Schenck, who is the Dean of College Relations and Development at North Idaho College, and I shall ask Janelle to commence the questioning.
Randall, you have a very interesting background and one that makes you particularly suited to talk about Amelia Earhart and to be interested in her. Can you help us and enlighten the viewers today as to what your interests are that kind of coincide with those of Amelia?
Well, to begin with, I flew and was involved in both private and commercial aviation, and had perhaps a slightly higher than normal interest in historical stories that dealt with aviation feats and so on. And also at the time of my early involvement with this, I was editor at Air Progress magazine, which at that time was one of the industry monthlies. So not only did I have an opportunity to know a little bit more than perhaps the average person about the technical aspects of the Amelia Earhart flight, and of course had been fascinated with the disappearance and the ongoing mystery, but I think was sort of poised in a position to be able to become involved in this more or less by accident, but at least at a time when it became possible to develop information and find out a lot more about what happened back that far.
So actually you are a pilot yourself, and you have some interest in writing. What also happened, is this an anniversary as well of the Amelia Earhart? Why is it so timely right now? Why are we so interested in it?
I think the level of interest that we're seeing around the country, not just in terms of my book, but in the popular media, in magazines, in advertisements, we're seeing Amelia Earhart popping up more and more. It seems in many ways that she's as popular now as she was when she was flying in the 1930s. I think there are a number of reasons for that. One is that people love a mystery, and this has been an ongoing fascination with many people for all those years. There are a number of books out, including mine. There's also a very fine book by Susan Ware, also published by W.W. Norton, Amelia Earhart Still Missing, addressing the early phases of the feminist movement in the United States and Amelia's eventual role in that. And I think the lack of a definitive solution up until now has availed toward a higher level of interest in this historical figure than perhaps they would normally enjoy.
Steve Schenck.
Could you help? There are sure people in the audience who are like I am, young and weren't alive when Amelia Earhart was flying. Just how big a personality was Amelia? How much of the fact that the public's still fascinated by Amelia Earhart is due to her disappearance, and how much of it was due to the fact that she really was a remarkable aviator?
Well, I think first and foremost that the level of interest in Amelia Earhart was due to her unique personality and her outstanding achievements, and certainly the not inconsiderable factor of the tremendous amount of promotion that was done by George Palmer Putnam, who was her husband and also was the president of the G.P. Putnam and Sons publishing company. A master promoter. There was non-Perial as far as the ability to get behind a personality and promote them. He, for example, had, prior to his involvement with Amelia, had published Charles Lindbergh's account of his transatlantic solo flight. But there's no doubt that Amelia, in and of herself, had a tremendous popular appeal. And she was working at a time when the feminist movement was in its early stages in terms of wide popularity and was in a state of evolution. She was achieving things that in many cases women had never done, had not had an opportunity to do. And in many cases she was setting records and accomplishing feats that neither man or woman had accomplished. So what you have is a combination of historical serendipity, the right place at the right time. You've got a very outstanding, very plucky individual, and you've got a tremendous promotional dynamo behind that individual.
Plus, of course, the mystery of her disappearance.
Then you have the mystery of her disappearance, which in and of itself was rated by the Associated Press as one of the 10 biggest stories in modern history. Certainly we've seen the fascination with that story as it has unfolded over the last 60 years. So I think that in many ways the best thing that happened to the reputation and the staying power of Amelia Earhart's personality and her popularity was her disappearance. That's obviously ironic, but I think had a lot to do with it.
You said just a moment ago that there are other books out about Amelia Earhart, a number of other books out. Has anyone else but you posed the possibility that that you have in your book that and I don't want. I guess is it all right at this point to reveal the?
You can, and I'll follow up on that.
All right,
Steve.
fine. You posed the possibility that what she was actually doing was spying for the United States against the Japanese, and in your book you also state that that was a bit out of character for her, that she was was a pacifist. Has anyone else stumbled across this, or is that yours and yours alone?
I can't take credit for the idea that there might have been a government involvement, or in this case an espionage element to the last flight of Amelia Earhart. That was done at least as early as the late 60s when Fred Gorner of CBS News got involved in this story and wrote a very interesting book, The Search for Amelia Earhart, which was published by Doubleday in, I believe, 1967. He postulated that in all likelihood, from the evidence that he was able to obtain, that there was a government element. He had spoken with a number of high-ranking military officials who kept him working toward military-oriented files and information. And I think that he probably, he and Joe Gervais, who I've worked with, certainly are credited with identifying that possibility. But the difference is that although there were 2 or 3 other books that involved the speculation about government involvement, those were written at a time when it was nearly impossible to obtain definitive information, very difficult to compel the U.S. government to release classified materials, and of course they did not also have the advantage that I did of a few very lucky breaks where individuals came forward and told a version of the story that was quite dramatically different from the historical record. I think that's pretty much the way that this story has evolved from speculation and conjecture to substantive evidence.
So you're really speaking of the Freedom of Information Act. That was one thing that was assistance to you. Randall, for our viewers who have not yet seen your book, we're going to take them through a few excerpts to build upon what Steve was asking. One of the things that I found impressive about your book was the documentation about your thesis. On the screen is going to come in a moment a passage. We're going to have both passages and some photographs here to allow you the opportunity to suggest more detail about your thesis. Would you speak to the 3 paragraphs that are on the screen at this time?
At this time we're looking at what I always thought was just a very, very illuminating quote from President Roosevelt. he's talking to Henry Morgenthau, who, in addition to being Secretary of the Treasury throughout most of the Roosevelt administration, was also a very close confidant of the president's. He's saying, never let your left hand know what your right is doing. And they go through this dialogue, and I think what it points out is that history shows us that FDR, in addition to being certainly one of the cagiest and most capable presidents that ever lived, had a penchant for things secretive. He loved the intrigues. He loved the use of the military services in ways that not only were in the national interest, but would sort of facilitate America's role in world power. And I think that's an important point.
And so to insert this in proper context is that President Roosevelt was in office at the time that the disappearance took place.
That's correct.
And so there is a relationship that you've shown concerning maybe the secretive aspect. We're going to now put a photograph on the screen, and I think this also sets the stage for you in the sense that these are the 4 people that were probably most key in Amelia Earhart's flight. And would you identify those individuals for us?
Well, on the screen from left to right is George Palmer Putnam, who, as I mentioned, was the G.P. Putnam son's president. Amelia Earhart, of course. Harry Manning, who in the early stages of this flight was the official navigator. He was a captain with the United States Navy. And on the end, Bo McNeely, who was Amelia's personal mechanic. And here, what we're seeing are sort of the dramatis persona of the first flight that Amelia made in an attempt to fly around the world at the equator, a flight which unfortunately ended in an accident and mishap in Honolulu, Hawaii. But it's the second attempt at the world record that resulted in her eventual disappearance.
Now, to follow this story on in relation to photographs, we also have one that will come up on the screen and momentarily dealing with the fact that it was your understanding when you started this research that Amelia Earhart did not have a military background, but explain what this ceremony is and a key person that is in the photograph with her.
Well, Tony, I can at least give a partial explanation for this. Clearly, Amelia is being sworn in some fashion. Also, pretty obviously, she's surrounded by military officers and very high-ranking ones. For example, the officer on the far left side of the screen is General Oscar Westover, who at that time was the Commander-in-Chief of the United States Air Force, Army Air Force, the predecessor organization to the U.S. Air Force. So clearly there's something of relatively high importance going on here, given the stature of the personnel that was viewed, and I think very interesting from a standpoint of a comment that Steve made earlier. It was well known in all of the biographical information that I've been able to find and that most people have seen that Amelia Earhart was a rather high-profile pacifist, did not particularly condone or relish any role in military affairs, and here we have her being sworn to office in some way or the other.
So this possibly could suggest that if the thesis is valid that she was spying, that there would be some connection of preparing her for that prior to the flight? There's
certainly that prospect, and there's the obvious question that arises is, if not that, then why the swearing-in ceremony? The picture was taken under what I would have to say are rather peculiar circumstances. Amelia wearing a flying helmet, and in a portion of the picture that you can't see, she's rather formally dressed, notwithstanding her flight suit. But in addition to asking a good many questions more than it answers, is certainly indicative of what I think was going on.
Certainly produces the question in my mind that if you were on a secret mission, if that's what was happening, why would you document it with such things as photographs unless you were maybe documenting it for history later? But I think the next thing going on the screen is going to be even stronger evidence for your thesis. Would you explain that this particular one is headed to White House, Washington, and this sets the stage for some suggestions that the national government and the White House knew what was possibly happening and how they were going to keep it secret?
Well, in a telephone conversation that took place and is excerpted in the book, Mrs. Roosevelt's secretary
Eleanor Roosevelt.
Eleanor Roosevelt's secretary, is calling Henry Morgenthau Jr., the Treasury Secretary, and asking for some information that he has about the disappearance of Amelia Earhart. In this graphic, we're seeing the response. Malvina Scheider, who was Mrs. Roosevelt's secretary, is responding saying that the secretary has declined the request for the information and said that he did not feel that it should be made public. And so here we have a very high-ranking cabinet officer, probably the closest member of the cabinet to the president, telling Mrs. Roosevelt that he'd rather not provide the information she requested. I would submit that it would take something pretty important for the secretary to put himself in that position.
There's something here that's very, very interesting in this conversation, and our viewers saw on the screen, but when it indicates that and I'm quoting, it seems they have confidential information which would completely ruin the reputation of Amelia. Isn't that something that you really zeroed in on? And I guess I have a follow-up question before you answer that, and saying that, and we were struggling for our survival in World War II with Germany and Italy and Japan. I'm puzzled, even if it was found out that she was spying to defend the country of the United States, and when we're struggling for survival, I'm puzzled how that would be ruining her reputation. It would seem like that she'd even be more of a hero defending the country.
I've thought about that a great deal, and I think you're right. For one thing, we can never know exactly what information the Secretary was referring to, because he clearly did not release this information, and I don't think it's been released to this day. Certainly we've touched on aspects of it here. We've pointed out the close tie-in with the Roosevelt administration to the Amelia Earhart flight. But in the furtherance of the answer of that, I really believe that the United States, as you know, was in the grips of a Depression-era, very strident isolationism, very little in the way of military funds and expenditures. The Congress was very isolationist, and the Neutrality Act of 1935, for example, had been signed by the President in the years prior to Amelia's disappearance. FDR was in a position where he dared not indicate any involvement in covert activities that were not provided for by Congress.
The conditions were very different then than now.
Extremely different.
We're running out of time almost. I mean, I need to get back to the panel, but we do have another document that there's also a powerful sentence or two here that you want to refer to, I know.
Well, if you read through those paragraphs, you'll see that the Secretary, again referring to this conversation with Mrs. Roosevelt's secretary, is indicating that he just does not want to make this information that he has in his possession public, that it would be detrimental, perhaps not just to Amelia Earhart and her reputation, but to the administration. And certainly we must infer from this language that the Secretary is looking out at least as much for the administration's interest as he might be for Amelia and her reputation.
So this has come from Secretary Morgenthau's diary, is it?
That's correct. These documents were procured from the Franklin D. Roosevelt Library in Hyde Park.
We couldn't get the whole thing up on the screen at once. Now we're doing the latter part, and is again a reference here that's of significance.
Excuse me. The last line on that page indicates that there had been requests for people wanting the U.S. government to again search. This conversation took place in 1938. There was clearly a great deal of information and speculation along the lines that perhaps Amelia had come down in an area not searched by the original U.S. Naval Task Force that was sent out there in the immediate aftermath of her disappearance. And people wanting, including George Putnam and Jacqueline Cochran, who was a contemporary of Amelia Earhart's and a very prominent individual in her own right, wanting additional searches. And the government's in the position of saying we are unable to do these searches because to do so would require that they conduct them in an area that was the proprietary territory of Japan.
Janel Berg.
Well, we've talked a little bit about the fact that Amelia might have been doing some kind of covert activity, some kind of spying activity, but what do you think really happened to her then?
Well, the evidence that we have suggests that for several days after her supposed disappearance, that she was still broadcasting radio signals, indicating clearly that due to the technical nature of her equipment, she had to have been on land, could not have been ditched at sea, as had been the speculation. These radio broadcasts were not well known, and in most cases were reported by either agencies of the government or closely affiliated operations such as Pan American Airways and so forth. Many years later, I had the opportunity to correlate these messages and pinpoint the origin of them to the Marshall Islands. We also were able to interview a number of natives in the Marshall Islands area who had seen these people. Amelia Earhart, her navigator Fred Noonan, had seen her airplane, were able to describe it in very close detail. And the number of witnesses, the veracity of the witnesses, the descriptions that they gave are simply too much evidence to overlook. So what we're seeing here is a pattern beginning to develop where the administration is involved early on in the planning and the execution of the Earhart flight. We now are able to get the radio messages that were secret and in classified materials for many years. We have the testimony of islanders, we have the sightings, we have some additional photographs which are reproduced in the book indicating that the airplane had been taken to one of the Japanese fortified islands and so on. So rather than any one smoking gun piece of evidence that we always wish for in these matters, what we have is a very complex but a very intricately interrelated series of pieces of evidence.
So it looks like she probably was at least in the Marshall Islands and maybe some other places too. Is there any evidence to put her in another location at a later date?
She was taken by eyewitness accounts to the island of Jaluit for some medical attention. I was able to interview the medical personnel that treated her. The airplane, according to these witnesses, was to be taken to a little island called Taroa in the upper Marshall Islands. We've since had an opportunity to see photographs that indicate that it was there. Ultimately, we have a number of witnesses saying that she was sighted on the island of Saipan, several hundred miles farther west from where she was determined to be down, and that she was imprisoned there for a period of time. Now, beyond that, indications are that she was taken to Tokyo and eventually to a quote, civil assembly center, which is rather a polite way of saying a prison camp, where she may have survived the remainder of the war.
And all of those areas were under Japanese domination at that time, is that correct?
Yes, and I think an interesting aspect of that is that the Japanese were given control and dominion over those islands as a result of the Versailles Treaty of 1919, but the stipulation was that they were not to fortify them. They must use them only for civilian purposes. The Roosevelt administration clearly was getting signals that the Japanese were in fact fortifying. Of course, we had the additional indications of Japanese hegemony at that time. They had taken Manchuria in 1933. They were aiming toward Southeast Asia. There was a great deal of concern as to when, not necessarily if, Japan would eventually launch an attack or some aggression in the Pacific Islands. I think that serves as a basis for everything that the administration did, and I think quite properly under the circumstances.
Steve Shea.
Randall, what do you think eventually happened to Amelia Earhart? You can track her, or you believe you have evidence that indicates her eventual progression from the islands to Japan itself, possibly ending up in a prison camp. Did she die in that camp? Was she executed at in the last days of the war as the Japanese saw themselves bound to lose? What do you think actually happened?
There's no evidence that she was executed. In fact, in some of the early works there was speculation about that, but never any evidence, and so we almost have to rule that out, being illogical and for lack of evidence. I feel that there is some compelling evidence that she did survive the war in Japanese captivity, as did actually a number of prominent American POWs. There was a prisoner of war file on Amelia in the U.S. State Department. I've reproduced some of the documents from that here. One of the things, Steve, that I've tried very hard not to do in producing this book was to go out too far on a speculative limb. So I would just issue the caveat that anything I say about what may have ultimately happened to Amelia is strictly speculative, and I don't go into that to much of a degree in the book. But I think the evidence is that there was an attempt made to evacuate Amelia. There were some witnesses that had testified to this. that there was an attempt made to evacuate Amelia from the Weishin, China Civil Assembly Center. We don't know whether or not that evacuation effort was successful, and frankly the trail grows completely cold from that point on. It's going to endure as a part of the mystery that we're just not able to solve, I think.
Well, what you said about not speculating leads me to my last question. Social scientists have a technique they call null hypothesis. They use to critique their own work. They just turn their hypothesis around and say, if it were wrong, what would I expect to find? In your research, is there a weak link that you see? Is there something that troubles you, something you're unable to explain with the information that you've got?
There's probably a number of those things. Anytime you build a very complicated case out of circumstantial evidence, there's going to be a certain level of discomfort with any one conclusion that you might draw. And of course there's always the elements of doubt, and there's always the elements of variables that could have worked their way into to the scenario as it unfolded. I think the most troubling element to this is that our efforts to obtain the flip side of the issue in terms of what the Japanese knew and what is in their files and records is probably my most difficult aspect, because the Japanese insist that they have no information about this and had no involvement with it, and yet it's clear that the U.S. government made diplomatic overtures to try to get permission to search in these areas that I've mentioned, and those requests were all denied, indicating, one, that the Japanese had some knowledge and complicity in this matter, but then, on the other hand, with their denials and refusals to cooperate with information, it indicates that there's probably a lot of this story that resides in the archives in Japan that we may or may not ever have access to.
We're almost out of time, about a minute left, but one thing that I thought of as you were telling us this story is that if there was the build-up in the islands by the Japanese and they were denying it, that could certainly explain one reason why they might be attempting, from the viewpoint of the government of the United States, to have someone to do surveillance. And so did you think that could be the most important reason why she might have done it, if that was the case?
I think that is the most important reason why she would have done it. I think the administration would have appealed to Amelia on the basis of her patriotism. I think that they would have ameliorated her pacifism by addressing it in a sort of a peremptory fashion, perhaps as an effort to forestall or even prevent the outbreak of war in the Pacific, and I think that on that basis she would logically have cooperated. But it's very key that the Japanese were undertaking fortifications that were illegal and very secret.
On that note, in the program we just got started, Randall Brink, on behalf of the panel and our staff, we thank you very much for being with us on this fascinating book that you've written entitled Lost Star: The Search for Amelia Earhart. Thank you for your time.
Well, it's very, very, very gratifying to have this kind of discussion. Time flies.
Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you'll be with us again next week at the same time, and we'll discuss yet another subject. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum was videotaped live from the studios of Instructional Technology on the campus of North Idaho College for viewing at this more appropriate time. We invite you to join us again next week for another all-new edition of the North Idaho College Public Forum on this public television station.